Hello, today I'm going to explain what no self is. No self is a big realization in the path to enlightenment. The way I'm going to explain this is to start with how the mind normally apprehends a person. When you look at somebody, like you are, I assume, looking at me right now, the mind imagines that something exists over here. And that this thing feels like it has certain properties. So now I'm going to explain what some of those properties are, and you can see if this agrees with how your mind non-reflectively sort of interprets what it's looking at. Okay, the first thing is it feels like there is a singular entity here. That it feels like there's a self which is singular. It doesn't feel like there is a team of things which is collaborating, and that collective effort is what generates my thoughts and words that I'm speaking to you. Instead, it feels like I am simply speaking. It feels like Bodin, this singular being, is talking to you, not a team but an individual. Another property is it feels like the apparent self exists at multiple moments in time. So it feels like the person talking to you now is the same self who was talking to you at the start of this video. It also feels like there is a boundary or a border, so that I am located within my body and not me is located outside of the body. So there's this clear like yes or no sort of boundary situation. And there's actually several more properties we could go through, but I'll just do one more, which is it feels like the self is causally responsible for the actions of the body and mind. It feels like it's independent, it's able to act independent of its environment or situation. When somebody is rude to you, for example, the default response isn't a innumerable collection of historical events and the present context of this situation. All of these things are combining to generate what that person said to me. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like this person decided of their own free will to be rude to me, and they could have chosen otherwise. This is where ideas of like moral responsibility come from. It feels like there are these individual selves which are the originators, the free deciders of what they do and say. Okay, so that's some properties of the apparent self, and I hope that this agrees with how you normally apprehend people. Unless you're like totally enlightened and just watching this video for fun, then you might not experience these things that I'm talking about. Okay, now what I want to do is to look if we can find a self that matches these categories, that has these properties. And there's two ways to do this. The first is to look at our sensory experience. It seems like a reasonable criteria for what exists or doesn't exist is what do we directly experience in our sensations. That seems like a reasonable criteria. So when you look at me, you're experiencing colors, and you experience sounds from my voice. If we were in the same room, you would experience touch sensations if you touched me. Are any of those things a self? No, they're just like sensations. They're a different type of thing. So you don't experience the self of another person, directly through your sensations. As for yourself, you experience sounds, touch, and colors of yourself, but you would also experience like inner physical sensations, thoughts, and emotions. Are any of those a self? No. Even something like a thought only exists for like a moment. So the self wouldn't, does the self only exist for a moment? Is that how we apprehend a self? No. If anything, it would feel like the self is the thinker of a thought, so it's somehow unexperienced. Anyways, so we can't find self in sensory experience. The other approach, the other way to look for a self is to use more traditional rational argument. or like rational analysis. So let's do that right now. Remember, the first thing I said was the apparent self seems like it is singular. Is there a singular entity over here? No. There's a collection of things. There's a collection of human parts. You could call it cells, atoms. There's a collection of things, neurons. In other words, this is plural. So there's no self. That was pretty easy, right? But let's keep going for fun. So another one was, it feels like there's a self that exists at multiple moments in time. Well, that's not really true, because nothing here that has the characteristics, the apparent characteristics of a self, exists unchanging throughout time. The body and mind, the cells are constantly aging, atoms are being replaced with other atoms or moving around. The mind is non-identical at every moment in time, personality changes. So there's constant change and replacement in terms of the body and mind. And even if you could find something that doesn't change, like maybe there's like a piece of bone that is unchanged throughout your entire life, that doesn't have the characteristics of a self. That doesn't count, right? It doesn't have, because a self is thought of as like a doer of actions, experiencer of things, a thinker of thoughts, and so on. And a bone fragment in your tooth is not this, doesn't have the characteristics of a self, right? So that's another reason there's no self. I'm trying to remember the order. I think the third thing I said was, it feels like there's a clear boundary where the self is located within the body and not the self is located outside of the body. Well, that kind of assumes that there is a self, but one thing we could say is, and so it's not really, well, think about it this way. There is no clear boundaries. There are no clear boundaries between the skin and the rest of the world, or between the brain and the rest of the world. You breathe in air, you eat food, you take in ideas. Right now, you can think of an idea as leaving my body, entering your brain. So there's constant like shuffling around. There's really no absolute boundaries. Your ability to act extends beyond your body, right? Like again, when I speak to somebody, if I make a video, my like influence is extending way beyond my body, depending on where people are located that watch my video. When you write something down, it's like your thoughts have left your body. So the sphere of influence is not restricted to your body. Materials come in and out through the boundary of your skin. So I don't think there's any clear boundaries here, right? If you're like, you feel like you're in a relationship, you might feel like, me and the other person is like, I don't know where I start or where you begin or something like that. Like sometimes people can get like that when you feel really close to somebody, like I don't know where I end and you begin or something like that, right? So even in a phenomenal sense, our sense of identity can extend beyond our body. So yeah, there's certainly no absolute boundary. The last thing I said was, it feels like the self is the independent causal originator of things. Well, the body and mind is, of course, determined by a long history of events, and even everything is inherited basically. So the language that you think in was something given to you from outside. There's factors of your education, how you were raised, and even like the environment that you find yourself in right now is influencing like your mood, thoughts, and so on. Right now, I am in a room alone talking to a camera. This affects and co-determines my thoughts and my actions. The way I'm talking right now is not the exact same way I would talk to my mom on the phone, right? When you're at work, you have a different personality versus when you're like at the gym versus when you're like at a bar or something, right? So that's not just you adjusting to the situation, but that's you being created by the situation, right? So in terms of causal origination, like you have the amount of factors that go into what you say or think or do at any moment is innumerable, and most of them you're not consciously aware of. So there isn't an independent doer of things. Okay, so what we've done so far just now is we've gone through 4 of the apparent properties of self, and we found that there is no entity that exists that has any of those properties. So what is going on? Why do we think that there is a self if there isn't anything like that? What happens is the mind imagines that there is a self. It creates this fictional entity, and then you can think of it, it like puts it on people. It mentally puts it on a person, and then it feels like this thing which the mind has created is this external real object, right? It's like I imagine something, and then I forget that I imagined it, and I think that that's actually a real entity in the real world. So that's really what the normal experience of persons is like, of selves is like, is your mind imagines a person. I shouldn't mix up person and self, because it's really, you can think of a person as acceptable, as we can say a person exists, but the self is like the person with the addition of the essences and the mental projection. So the self is what we're trying to do away with here, not the person. But that's not really super important. But yeah, so long story short, the self is a mental projection from your own mind, which is then confused to actually be some real objectively existing entity that exists even when you're not thinking about it, but it only exists when you're thinking about it because it's a mental fiction. And so like real realization that there is no self, what that really means is the removal of that projection, or at the very least realizing that it isn't objectively real.